In the last episode, we talked about the Assyrian Empire, which terrorized the surrounding nations with its cruelties for 300 years. Its last two kings even invaded Egypt. But the Assyrians were eventually conquered by the Babylonians. Well, David has visited Babylon many times and in fact even slept amongst its ruins. And today he'll be telling us about the story of the Golden City of Babylon.
Well, Babylon certainly was a magnificent city. Isaiah calls it the city of gold, and gold was just about as plentiful as the dust of Babylon is today. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, was a marvellous conqueror, and he was an obsessed builder. He just built palace after palace, temple after temple in old Babylon. And a visit to Babylon today, even though it's lying in ruins, gives you some idea of what a magnificent city it was. We enter by the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar, of course, was the Babylonian fertility goddess, and this Ishtar Gate was dedicated to her. On the walls of this gate, you can see the Sarush, as they call them. They're composite creatures, and these were moulded bricks. In the Berlin Museum, Professor Koldewey, who excavated Babylon, has reassembled part of this gate. It was made of glazed bricks, beautiful blue glazed colours, and it must have been an impressive sight to walk through this gateway into the great procession street. And here the king and his captives were brought as they returned from their military campaigns. And here is the very procession street along which the captives were dragged. At the end of the procession street there is still standing there a pillar. As a matter of fact, it's used by the storks today to build their nests up on top of it. But this was one of the mighty pillars of Babylon. Not far away has been a reconstruction of the temple to Ninmach, one of the Babylonian deities. And this has been rebuilt as it was in the days of ancient Babylon, just one of the many temples that had been erected by King Nebuchadnezzar. And then there was the palace throne room. All you can see today is just the floor of this throne room, and of course the great hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world. You know what hanging gardens are? It doesn't mean they were dangling by a rope or something like that. It simply means that these gardens were built up and suspended over a watercourse. And Koldewey, the great excavator, German excavator of Babylon, found what he considers to be the foundation of this hanging garden and the conduits through which the water came, and they were drawn up onto the garden. You know why he had this hanging garden? Let me tell you. You see, when Nebuchadnezzar and his father conquered the city of Nineveh in Assyria in 612 BC, the whole campaign was sealed by the marriage of Nebuchadnezzar to the daughter of Cyaxares, the Median king. Her name was Amyrtis. Now, she came from the highlands of Media, up there near Hamadan, up to 2,000 metres above sea level. It was pretty cool, beautiful gardens up there. And so when Nebuchadnezzar's princess was brought down to Babylon to live in the sweltering heat there, like a good husband, he decided to try and make her feel at home. And so he built these beautiful hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world, just to make his wife happy. Isn't that nice? And so we have the hanging gardens of Babylon. And then there were the great residential areas and the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, it must have been a tremendous city. And you can walk all around the ruins of Babylon today and get some idea of what an enormous and magnificent city it was. Do you know it was 10 miles, that's about 16 kilometres in circumference. Now, for those days, that was a huge city. When you think that Jericho was only 350 metres long by 150 metres wide, and here was Babylon, 16 kilometres in circumference, a huge double wall. You can see the foundations of the wall there today. And so this double wall was right around Babylon to protect it, and Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was building a city that would last for all eternity and starting a dynasty that would never die. How disappointed he would be to awaken up today and see what's happened to his beautiful city of Babylon. Well, Babylon started off a long time ago. You know, I believe it's the oldest city in the world. And we find the reference to its origins in Genesis chapter 11. Ever heard of the Tower of Babel? Well, we're told here that as the people travelled down from Mount Ararat along the river Euphrates, they came to this place called Babel, or Babylon. And they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. You know, that's historically very accurate, because there are lots of temple towers, or they call them ziggurats, in Mesopotamia, or what we call Iraq today. And you know what? They're made of bricks that have been burnt very, very thoroughly. They're so tough you drop them on the ground or smash them against each other, you can hardly break them open. And another thing is they are stuck together with asphalt, just exactly as the Babel builders built their Tower of Babylon. Now, where was this tower? Well, for a long time, a place called Burz Nimrud was regarded as the traditional Tower of Babel. But this was only because it was the tallest standing ziggurat in Mesopotamia. And so the early Christians, and for that matter the early Jews, thought that Burz Nimrud was the Tower of Babel. It is a temple tower, it is a ziggurat, and it goes up in stages, and it was very high. Right up on top later on, Nebuchadnezzar built a tower. That is not the tower. What you are looking at is the great, huge, man-made mountain of bricks, and that is Burz Nimrud. But however, the Tower of Babel, or the Babylonian Tower, was not here. It was naturally in Babylon itself. And just because it can't be seen there today, people think, well, that can't be it. But you see, when Alexander the Great came to Babylon, he decided to make that his headquarters, the capital city of his great empire. And he saw this temple tower, or ziggurat, which had become into a state of disrepair. And so he told his engineers, get busy and rebuild this. And they said, well, look, we can't do anything to patch this thing up. There's only one thing to do, and that is remove the whole thing, brick by brick, and then let's rebuild it from the foundations up. So he said, go ahead and do that. And so they removed this ziggurat and put it over in a nearby place. But before they could start rebuilding it, Alexander died while he was just a young man, only 32 years of age. And so it never got rebuilt. But Professor Koldewey excavated the foundations of it, and you can see them there today. What's under the water is the first stage, and this must have been a huge temple tower. And so the early Babel builders were the first city builders, and they built this great city of Babylon. But you know the story, how their languages were confused. They all spoke one language, naturally, being all descended from Noah, but their language was miraculously confused, and they started speaking different languages. They couldn't understand each other, and so they gave up, and they just went off in different directions according to their language groups. And so Babylon virtually fell into disrepair, and it was left for the great Assyrian Empire to take over. And for 1,500 years, the Assyrians dominated the Middle East, and Babylon was just a second-rate city. In the year 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Israel and surrounded Jerusalem, and he posed a very serious threat to it. I tell you, everyone there was scared to death. You fall into the hands of the Assyrians and you face the risk of being impaled or skinned alive. And so King Hezekiah and his courtiers and the people were terrified. But there was in Jerusalem at this time the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah made a very interesting prophecy. You'll find it here in Isaiah chapter 13 and in verse 19. Strange to say, the prophecy was not about Assyria, but about Babylon. You see, Isaiah was looking down the centuries and looking at something that was to happen a lot later. It says here, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation. Nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds make their sheepfolds there." Now that's a remarkable thing. Remember, this was 701 BC when Sennacherib was besieging Jerusalem. And here we have this prophecy by Isaiah, who was living at the time, saying Babylon is going to be destroyed. Well, it was only a few years later, 689 BC, when Sennacherib decided to destroy Babylon. He completely razed it to the ground. In fact, he even flooded the river Euphrates into it and made it just a big swamp. And I suppose people living back there thought, there you are, boy, just what the prophet said. He said it was going to be destroyed. But Babylon made a comeback. Under Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, Babylon was rebuilt. You see, it was a futile act to destroy it. And so Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon, and it once more became a great city. The founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or New Babylonian Empire, was King Nabopolassar. He came to the throne in the year 626 BC and immediately set about establishing an independent kingdom. Of course, the Assyrians didn't like this, but Nabopolassar amassed an army and started out on the march. It took him a long time, but finally in the year 614 BC, he felt strong enough to march on Ashur. Ashur was the great religious city of Assyria, and Nabopolassar conquered that city in the year 614 BC. The next move, of course, was the mighty Nineveh. And to attack this city, he formed an alliance with Cyaxares, king of the Medes, and together they launched an attack in the year 612 on the city of Nineveh. They were successful, conquered it, and destroyed it, burned it down to the ground, and the last king of Assyria died with his harem in the flames. And so Nabopolassar became the master of the Middle East. Now, there were a few ends to be tidied off, and so he had to march against some remnants of the Assyrian army, and it wasn't until the year 605 BC that ultimately he had undisputed rule over all of what was once Assyria. Then in the Battle of Carchemish, he defeated not only the remnants of the Assyrian army, but also the Babylonians who had come to try and put up some resistance with them, and so he became master of the Middle East. It was also in the year 605 BC that Nabopolassar died. Now his son, Nebuchadnezzar, was in charge of the military operations at the time against Jerusalem, and when he heard that his father had died in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar hastily rode back over the Syrian desert to claim the throne. And so Nebuchadnezzar mounted the throne in the year 605 BC and began a very prosperous rule of 43 years, and so began the great Neo-Babylonian Empire. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was a brilliant military leader. He was a good politician too, and he was a compulsive builder. It was his ambition to build a Babylon that would never be conquered, never be destroyed. He wanted to establish a dynasty that would never end. And no doubt he spent a lot of time thinking about the future, worrying about whether he would succeed in his great ambition. Well, one night he went to sleep and he had a dream. Now, the Babylonians attached a lot of importance to dreams. And in the morning when he wakened up, he knew that he had had a dream, and an important one. And so he called in his wise men, his astrologers and the magicians, and said, "Now listen, you fellas, I've had a dream, and I can't remember what it was. So I want you to tell me what I dreamed and the interpretation. Well, of course, the wise men were a bit at a loss. They said, look, you tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation. They could always think up a good interpretation, you know. But the king said, I can't remember the dream. If you tell me what the dream is, I will be sure that you know the right interpretation. But they said there's no man or God who can do a thing like that. Well, Nebuchadnezzar got pretty angry with them and drove them out and decreed that all the wise men were to be put to death. Well, at this time, Daniel, the young man from Judah, was in Babylon, the prophet, and he was included in these people that were to be put to death. And when he got the bad news, he said, well, what's it all about? And when he heard, he said, well, look, let me go into the king and talk to him, and we'll see if God can reveal this thing. So he went into King Nebuchadnezzar, and the king was only too glad to give him a little time to work it out. And that night, I guess, they did a lot of praying, you know. And during the night, God revealed to Daniel what the dream was. Next morning, he went into the king, and the king said, can you tell me what I dreamed last night? Daniel said, not I, but there is a God in heaven who can tell the king what he dreamed. He said, you, O king, dreamed that you saw a great image. Now this little image, as I have here, is just an artist's idea of what it was like, and it's a very small one. What the king must have seen was a very big, very impressive, awesome image. And Daniel went on to describe it. He said the head was of gold, the arms and the breast were of silver, the belly and the thighs were of brass, the legs were of iron, and the feet were part of iron and part of clay. He said, you kept watching this until you saw a stone taken from the mountain without hands, and it came crashing down on the feet of this image, ground it to powder, and the same with all the other metals. They were all ground to powder. And I guess as Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward intently listening, he recognized what he had dreamed. You know, dreams are like that. You do something to break them and you remember. Now, Daniel said, I will tell you the interpretation of this dream. Daniel said, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are represented by this head of gold, but your kingdom is going to be followed by a kingdom of silver, and then a third kingdom of brass, and then a fourth kingdom represented by the legs of iron, and finally the kingdom is going to be divided, symbolized by the clay and the iron. King Cyrus left a record of his conquest of Babylon in the year 539 BC. It is known as the Cyrus cylinder. It has cuneiform script on it, and it tells of his conquest of Babylon. Let me read you a translation of a portion of this cylinder, shall I? He says here, I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four rims of the earth, son of Cambyses, great king, king of Anshan. I think you've got the idea, haven't you? He's letting us know what a good fellow he was. Now he says this, all the kings of the entire world from the upper to the lower sea brought their heavy tributes and kissed my feet. I returned to sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been ruins for a long time. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. Now that, of course, is just exactly what the biblical record says in the book of Ezra, how Cyrus made a decree that all the Jews could return to their home city and rebuild Jerusalem. So on one hand we have the biblical record, on the other hand we have the Cyrus cylinder. They both tell us exactly the same story. In the year 530 BC, Cyrus the Great died and was replaced by his son Cambyses, who didn't last very long. And then he was replaced by what is known as the false Smerdis, and following that came Darius the Great, or Darius the First. Darius decided to record the throne that he grasped on the wall of the Behistun rock at a place called Bisatun in Persia. And there on the side of the wall in the cuneiform script in 3 different languages, so that everyone would get the message, Darius left the record of his ascent to the throne. It was King Darius who decided to build an essentially Persian city called Persepolis, literally meaning city of Persia. And this is sometimes referred to as the Pearl of Middle East ruins. Even today, it's a magnificent ruins, and it must have been a tremendous city in its heyday. Darius was followed by his son Xerxes, referred to in the Bible as Ahasuerus. You know, the king who married the beautiful Queen Esther. And Xerxes invaded Greece. It was a tremendous campaign, millions of people involved in it, and he met brave Leonidas at the pass, and it was there at Thermopylae that he murdered or killed Leonidas and moved down into Athens, and there he burnt the Acropolis. The Greeks never forgot this, and so it was when Alexander the Great came onto the scene. He first of all marched eastwards, conquered the Persian army, and then finally occupied Persepolis. And in retaliation, he burnt and destroyed Persepolis. And so you have the 3 great empires that followed Babylon. Babylon was followed by Persia. Persia was followed by Greece, or Macedonia actually, and then ultimately came the great Roman Empire. Rome, symbolized by the legs of iron, the iron monarchy of Rome, overwhelmed the Middle East. And so it was that Rome became the mistress, not only of the Middle East, but of Europe too. And for hundreds of years, Rome ruled the world, the then known world. The great Caesars and their followers became the masters of culture and politics and war. And so the arms of the Republic, sometimes vanquished in battle, always victorious in war, marched across Europe and established the great Roman Empire. But even Rome was not to last forever. Remember, the legs of iron were followed by the feet of clay. What is meant by that? Daniel 2 verse 41 says, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided." That seemed to be a divine decree that Europe would never again be united under a single rule. And hasn't that happened? People have tried to unite it, you know, the Holy Roman Empire, and then there was other would-be conquerors who tried to bind it together, Charlemagne, and then came Napoleon Bonaparte, who tried to unite Europe completely together. And then there were later ones. I mean, there was Kaiser Wilhelm in the 1914-18 war, and then there was Hitler in the 1939 war. Verse 43 says, "As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." Now this expression, mingle with the seed of men, is referring to marriage, into marriage. We are standing outside Buckingham Palace, and on my right over here is a statue of Queen Victoria. You know, in the late 19th century, Queen Victoria got the idea of marrying her family off to crown heads of Europe. The idea being, if they were all married to one another, they wouldn't fight with one another. But of course it didn't work. It did not unite Europe any more than any other scheme has. You know, this text is actually the text that first interested me in the Bible. It was in the early days of the war, and I was in the Australian Army as an officer in the artillery. And I attended a lecture. I didn't really realise it was a religious lecture, but the title of the lecture was 7 Words That Spell Hitler's Doom. Well, at the time, Hitler was doing pretty well. And as an officer in the army, I knew very well that the Commonwealth, especially Britain itself, was not really prepared to face up to him. And I was a bit anxious. But I went along to this and I'd never heard anything like it. Here was this lecturer saying that Hitler would not succeed because this verse said it would all never be united again. it says the kingdom shall be divided. But of course he was right, the Bible was right. Hitler did not succeed. And let me tell you that neither communism nor the common market or anything else is ever going to succeed in uniting the nations of Europe successfully together. Now it says, in the days of these kings, verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. This was symbolized by the stone cut out of the mountain without hands that smashed the image on its feet and ground the whole thing to pieces. In other words, ground up all the kingdoms of this world. The end of the world at the second coming of Jesus Christ is here depicted. We are told here in Matthew chapter 21 and in verse 44, Jesus Christ refers to this. He says, and whosoever falls on this stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder. Well, which do you want? Obviously, you don't want to be ground to powder, do you? It's better to fall on this rock. What does that mean? In Psalms 51 and in verse 17, it says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, these you will not despise. Have you done something wrong? Have you sinned against God, or have you done something that gives you a guilty conscience? Then just come to Jesus Christ and fall at his feet and say, Lord, I'm sorry. And Jesus Christ has promised to take your sins, and he has paid the price for them. And so you can have forgiveness by coming to the stone that is referred to here and be broken in heart, be sorry for your sins. But the end of the world, according to this prophecy, will surely come, just as surely as the other kingdoms have come and gone, just as surely as the other aspects of the prophecy have all been fulfilled, so will this. We better be ready.
Like many people, I used to laugh at the idea of the world coming to an end, but I don't anymore. I think with all the frightening things that are happening around us, we must expect that this world can't go on the way it is. In our next program, we visit that famous old Italian city of Pompeii, which in 79 AD came to a disastrous end. I think there might be a message in that for us today.